Welcome back, everyone. If you're here for a good scary story, you're in the right place. Every nightmare begins with something ordinary. A phone call, a text, a stranger, a single moment that doesn't seem important until it's far too late. And tonight, you're about to hear one of those stories. Today, you're about to hear a terrifying ghost story from Hollow Creek, a chilling tale about the Walker House, a haunted farmhouse where voices came from empty rooms. Something mimicked the dead, and the evil inside didn't disappear. It followed people home. Lock the door, look over your shoulder one last time, and let's dive into tonight's nightmare. Based on statements collected in Ashe County, North Carolina, between 1987 and 2019, people in Hollow Creek still don't like saying the Walker House out loud. If you're at the diner and you ask about it too casually, somebody will look up from their coffee. If you bring it up at the gas station, there's a good chance the old guys by the ice freezer will go quiet all at once, like you just said a name you weren't supposed to know. Most towns have ghost stories. Hollow Creek had rules. Don't cut through the Walker property after sundown. Don't answer if somebody calls your name from the tree line. And if you ever see a light moving around upstairs in that house, keep driving. I didn't grow up there, so when I first heard all that, I thought it was exactly what it sounded like. Small town folklore. The kind people hold on to because life gets boring and fear gives a place its own flavor. I was 28 when I moved to Hollow Creek in the fall of 2017. I'd just taken a job restoring county land records and church archives for a regional history project. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough. And honestly, after a divorce and one ugly year in Charlotte, I wanted quiet. Hollow Creek definitely had quiet. It sat in the western edge of North Carolina, where the roads narrowed, the woods thickened, and people still gave directions based on trees that had been cut down 20 years ago. I rented a little white farmhouse from a widow named Mrs. Weller, about 10 minutes outside town. It had a sagging porch, ancient plumbing, and the kind of silence at night that made your ears ring. The Walker property was another mile down the road, past a dry creek bed and an overgrown split-rail fence half swallowed by kudzu. The first time I saw the house, I understood why people talked. It wasn't some dramatic gothic mansion with towers and stained glass. Honestly, that would have been less unsettling. The Walker House was a plain two-story farmhouse built sometime in the 1850s, with a tin roof, warped siding, and a screened porch collapsing inward like a broken jaw. It sat alone on a little rise surrounded by black oaks, and the windows on the second floor looked wrong somehow. Too dark, too flat, like empty eye sockets painted onto the face of the house. I only glanced at it while driving by, but I got this weird pressure in my chest, like when you realize someone's been staring at you for longer than is socially acceptable. That night, I mentioned it to Mrs. Weller when she came by with a pie I absolutely did not deserve. "The old Walker place," she said. "Yeah, creepy-looking house." She set the pie down on my counter and kept her hand on it a second longer than necessary. "You don't need to be fooling around over there," I laughed. "Wasn't planning to." "I mean it." The way she said it made me stop smiling. She was in her 70s, little and bird-boned, with a smoker's voice and eyes so pale they looked almost silver in the kitchen light. "I've lived on this road 53 years, she said, "and I can tell you straight, you leave that place alone, it'll leave you alone." "That sounds very much like the start of a story." "It is," she said, "just not one with a good ending." Then she left. That should have been enough. In normal life, warnings from old women with haunted expressions should probably be enough, but curiosity is a stupid kind of hunger. The more people avoided talking about the Walker house, the more I wanted the full story. I started at the archives. That was my job anyway. Cataloging land deeds, death records, probate files, church rolls. Most of it was boring, dry stuff. Property disputes, marriage licenses, handwritten wills where people left one mule and all tack to their sons and the blue chest to their daughters. Then I found the Walkers. The land had first been deeded in 1849 to an Elias Walker, a widower originally from eastern Tennessee. He moved to Hollow Creek with his 2 children, Ruth and Samuel. Church records showed he remarried in 1852 to a woman named Margaret Bell, age 19. 3 years later, there was a burial listing for Margaret Walker. Cause of death wasn't recorded. Then Samuel. Then Ruth. No causes. By 1858, Elias Walker was the only listed occupant of the property. That alone wasn't all that unusual for the time. People died young, records were sloppy, disease tore through mountain communities all the time, but then came a note tucked into a county court ledger from 1861, written by a magistrate named Joel Pritchard. Complaint received from neighboring properties concerning disturbances at the Walker residence. Livestock found mutilated. Repeated sounds of distress heard after midnight. Mr. Walker uncooperative. Property not entered due to armed refusal. I sat there staring at that line for a long time. Property not entered due to armed refusal. It got stranger. In 1863, during the war, Elias Walker disappeared from tax records completely. The property remained in legal limbo until 1871, when it was transferred to a cousin in Boone, who apparently never lived there. Nobody seemed to claim the house after that. Over the next 100 years, there were occasional mentions. Hunters vanishing dogs near the property, trespass complaints, one deputy report in 1934 noting unexplained vocalizations within vacant structure. Vocalizations. That word got under my skin. A week later, I was at Miller's Diner downtown, drinking burnt coffee and pretending not to eavesdrop, when I heard 2 men at the counter mention the old woman they found by Walker Creek. I looked over. One of them noticed and said, "You ain't from here, are you?" "Nope." He nodded. Like that explained my bad manners. "Then stop listening like you are." The waitress, a heavy-set woman named Dana, who had adopted me against my will on day 3, topped off my mug and said, "He's the history guy. Been asking about old records." The 2 men exchanged a look. Finally, the older one swiveled on his stool and said, "If you're digging around in that house's history, you ought to talk to Earl Sutter." "Who's that?" "Last man dumb enough to spend a night in there and come back talking." Dana muttered, "That is not how that happened." The man ignored her. "Lives out past 3 Pines Baptist. Double wide with a green roof. Can't miss it." I found Earl 2 days later. He was 84, on oxygen, and sitting under a carport in a folding chair with a blanket over his knees despite the heat. He looked like he'd been carved out of old leather. When I mentioned the Walker house, he didn't answer right away. He just stared at the road. Then he said, "Who told you to ask me?" "Some guys at the diner." "Figures." He spat into the gravel. "They don't have to remember it every night." I told him I was collecting local history. That part was true. I did not tell him I was starting to think every town buries one story so deep it ends up poisoning the ground over it. Earl gave a dry laugh that turned into a cough. "I was 16, he said finally. Summer of 58. Me and 2 friends, Calvin Reddick and Pete Lunsford, went up there on a dare. We'd heard all the same junk people always heard. Lights in the windows, sounds from the woods, folks saying somebody knocked on their back door at night, but nobody'd be there." He shook his head. "Teenage boys are idiots, you know that?" "I do. We took beer, a flashlight, and Pete's daddy's .22 like that was somehow gonna help us with a ghost." "What happened?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see something in his expression I didn't like. Not fear exactly, more like a person standing too close to a memory that had teeth. "We got there around dark. House was already bad off, but not like now. Front door hanging crooked. Porch still mostly standing. We go in laughing, acting tough, saying all the dumb stuff boys say when they're scared and don't want to admit it. He swallowed. First thing I noticed was the smell. Not rot, not exactly. More like wet dirt dug up fresh, mixed with something old, like clothes packed away in a dead person's trunk. I didn't say anything. We stayed in the front room for maybe an hour. Sun went down. We heard raccoons in the walls, wind outside, the usual. And then Pete says, "Y'all hear that?" Earl's fingers tightened over the blanket. There was somebody upstairs, walking, slow, just one end of the hall to the other, back and forth, back and forth. You thought it was another person? At first, sure, squatter maybe. Except this was the thing, every step sounded wrong. Too heavy for a person, but spread out, like if a horse learned how to walk upright. I felt goosebumps move up my arms. Pete started calling out, telling whoever it was to come on down. Calvin laughed, but not much. Then we heard what sounded like a woman crying, very soft, coming from upstairs. He stopped and rubbed at his face. "Now listen to me," he said. "This part matters." It sounded exactly like Calvin's mama. I frowned. What? Exactly like her. She'd died 6 months earlier. Cancer. I'd been to the funeral. And Calvin, he went white as paper soon as he heard it. He just stood up and said, "Mama?" like a little kid. "Jesus." "Yeah," Earl said. "That's about right." According to Earl, Calvin bolted for the staircase before either of them could stop him. Pete went after him, cursing. Earl followed with the flashlight. The second floor hallway was empty. No person, no animal, no movement. Just 4 doorways, all open, and moonlight coming through cracked windows. Then the crying started again, not down the hall, inside the room at the very end. Calvin ran to it. Earl's breathing had gotten shallow by then, and I almost told him to stop, but he kept going. When he hit that doorway, Earl said, he froze, just stood there. Pete shoved past him, raised that little rifle, and then he froze too. What did they see? Earl looked at me so long I almost asked again. Then he said very quietly, "Nothing that made sense." I waited. Room looked empty at first. Then the flashlight hit the corner by the window and there was a person standing there, or something shaped like one. Tall, real tall, too tall for the ceiling, but bent in the middle like it had folded itself to fit. I could hear a truck passing somewhere out on the road behind us, but it sounded far away. It had clothes on, Earl said. Old clothes, black coat, high collar, looked soaked through like it had just crawled out of the creek. But the face, he stopped. The face wasn't right. There wasn't one face. Those words sat between us in the hot afternoon air. What do you mean? I mean it kept changing. His voice dropped even lower, not fast like in movies, slow, like different people were underneath the skin, taking turns pressing forward. Old man, woman, boy, something with no eyes, then Calvin's mama again, smiling at him. I realized I'd stopped breathing normally. What did Pete do? He fired. Earl gave a humorless smile. You ever hear a .22 go off in a closed room, loud as hell, damn near blinded me, and when the shot hit that thing, it didn't bleed, didn't fall, it just sort of twitched, like it was surprised. Then he said the part that stayed with me longest. It opened its mouth, and Calvin heard his mama say, "Baby, come here." But me and Pete, we heard different voices. I heard my little sister. Pete heard his wife. That thing knew. What happened to Calvin? Earl looked back at the road. It reached for him. How? With an arm that was too long. That's the cleanest way I know to say it. He took off his oxygen tube for a second, wiped his nose, then put it back. Pete grabbed Calvin and we all ran. Calvin was screaming like somebody had him by the spine. We got him outside and halfway to the truck before we realized he wasn't screaming words. He was repeating something. What? Earl swallowed. It was here before the house. It was here before the house. Over and over. Calvin was institutionalized within the year. Pete drank himself to death by 40. Earl never went back. That should have been the end of it for me. Instead, I asked him the stupidest question possible. Do you think it was a ghost? Earl stared at me with the flat exhaustion of a man too old for dumb theories. No, he said. I think ghost is the word people use when the truth is worse. That night I didn't sleep much. Rain moved in around midnight, soft at first, then steady against the roof. Every old house talks in the rain. Pipes knock, wood settles, rafters crackle. But sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something outside that didn't fit. 3 knocks, not on the front door, on the side of the house, beneath the kitchen window. I sat up in bed. 3 more knocks, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was a branch. Then I heard my name, very soft, almost polite. Daniel. My whole body locked up. Only 3 people in Hollow Creek even called me Daniel. Everybody else said Dan. Mrs. Weller used Daniel. My ex-wife used Daniel when she was mad. And my mother, who had been dead 9 years, always used Daniel when she wanted me to come in from outside. The voice from under my kitchen window sounded exactly like my mother. I stayed in bed until morning with every light in the house on. At 8 a.m., I found muddy prints under the kitchen window. Not footprints, handprints. Long, smeared, almost human, except there were too many joints in the fingers. I should have called the sheriff. Instead, I drove straight to the Walker property. I know how that sounds. I know. But fear does weird things to common sense. Once something follows you home, a part of your brain decides the only way to survive is to look directly at it. The house stood in gray morning light with rain still dripping from the trees. Up close, it looked less abandoned than neglected, like it was waiting. The front steps sagged under my weight. The door hung open about 6 inches. Inside, the air was cold enough to raise goosebumps. Not cool. Cold. The smell hit me immediately. That same thing Earl described. Wet soil, old cloth, and something faintly sweet underneath, like flowers left too long on a grave. I had my phone flashlight in one hand and a tire iron in the other, which I'm aware was not exactly a plan. The first floor was mostly empty, rotting furniture, wallpaper peeling in strips, a stone fireplace sunk with ash and leaves. On the mantel, somebody had lined up 6 dead birds at some point in the recent past. They were dry as paper. I backed away from that and found the staircase. Every instinct I had told me not to go up. Then I heard movement overhead. Slow, back and forth, same as Earl described. I actually said out loud, "Nope," and started for the door. Then a woman's voice from upstairs said, "Please." I froze. Not my mother this time. My ex-wife, Laura. Not just similar. Perfect. All the blood drained out of my face. There are certain voices your body remembers before your mind does. That was one of them. "Dan," it said again, breaking just slightly on the word like she was trying not to cry. "Please come up here." My marriage had ended ugly. Ugly enough that hearing her voice like that hit some deep, stupid reflex in me before reason could catch up. I found myself stepping toward the stairs before I consciously decided to. Halfway up, I realized what was happening and stopped. The voice stopped too. Then another voice said, from somewhere down the hall, "Good, he learns." Male, elderly, not someone I knew. I nearly dropped the tire iron. At the top of the stairs, the hallway opened exactly like Earl said. Long, narrow, 4 doorways, pale light at the far end. No one there, no movement, just that oppressive wrongness, like the house was crowded with invisible people holding their breath. My phone light flickered once, then all 4 bedroom doors slammed shut at the same time. The sound was so violent the whole hall shook. I ran. I made it down the stairs so fast I slipped on the last 2 and slammed shoulder first into the wall. By the time I got outside, I was gasping hard enough to throw up in the weeds. From somewhere upstairs came laughter, not loud, not dramatic, just one short, amused exhale from several different throats at once. I went straight to the county office and requested everything they had on Elias Walker. There wasn't much, but what there was turned everything sideways. a newspaper fragment from 1857, local column, half destroyed. Enough remained to mention that Walker had been accused by neighbors of improper practices tied to burial grounds on former native land near Hollow Creek. Another note from a traveling preacher described Walker as a man in conversation with things not fit for Christian ears. Then I found the real piece, not in county files, in a church basement archive at Three Pines Baptist, inside a donation box of uncatalogued material, a journal, water damage, leather bound, initials E.W. Elias Walker. I spent 6 straight hours going through it with gloves on. Most of it was religious in that feverish, isolated frontier way people wrote when they believed heaven and hell sat just outside the tree line. But as the entries went on, the tone changed. He wrote about grief after his first wife died, about hearing her voice near the creek, about a presence in the stand of black oaks behind the house. At first he believed it was her spirit. Then he became convinced it was something older that could borrow the likeness of the beloved. One entry, dated October 18th, 1853, read, "It came to me in Margaret's voice and bid me open the room above the eastern wall. It knew things no devil should know. It spoke my sins with her tenderness. I allowed it across the threshold because it wore sorrow like my wife wore it." Another, a month later, "It does not enter as a guest, but as damp enters wood, quietly and all at once. Then, in a shaking hand, the children hear their mother singing, but it is not she." I had to stop reading after that and go outside for air. When I came back, the last pages were worse. Walker wrote that the thing in the woods had no fixed dead attached to it. It wasn't Margaret. It wasn't anyone. It was an appetite with a memory of faces. He believed it had been there before settlers came, maybe before the trail through Hollow Creek, maybe before the oldest stories anybody remembered. And according to him, once invited into a home by grief, it stayed, not haunted, occupied. The final readable page was dated February 2nd, 1855. Samuel is gone, though I hear him overhead each night. Ruth knocks from inside the walls. Margaret asks to be let from the root cellar, though I buried no Margaret there. The thing learns us quicker now. It speaks before we think. I know at last its cruelty. It does not kill the body first. It keeps what it can use. That line hit me like ice water. It keeps what it can use. After that, the journal turned to smeared ink and torn pages. I drove straight to Mrs. Weller's house with the journal in my passenger seat. She let me in before I knocked, which told me she'd seen me coming and probably knew exactly why. "You went in there," she said. "Yeah." She closed her eyes. Lord. On her kitchen table, between a sugar bowl and a basket of fake apples, I laid out everything I had. The records, my notes, the journal. When she saw Elias Walker's handwriting, something in her face changed. "My grandmother told me about this," she said softly. "Said her mother was one of the girls who helped wash the bodies after what was left got found." "What bodies?" She looked at me for a long second. "Daniel, the county never wrote down what happened up there because there weren't enough pieces to write down decent." I felt my stomach tighten. She sat and folded her hands. In 1858, some men from town finally went to the house. Walker had stopped coming in for supplies. They found the doors barred from inside, but no sign of him. Found blood in the upstairs hall. Found hair in the plaster. Found fingernail marks inside the root cellar door so deep the wood curled out. I asked the question, even though I didn't want the answer. "And the family?" "They found parts. That hung there." "Animal attack?" I asked, hearing how weak it sounded. She gave me a look. "Inside a locked house?" I couldn't argue with that. Then she leaned forward. "My grandmother's mother said the men who went in came out different. One shot himself that winter. One walked into the creek during church and drowned in 3 feet of water. The third stopped speaking entirely." "Why does the house still stand?" "No buyer ever kept it. No preacher ever blessed it. Once, in 1972, the county tried to tear it down. Bulldozer stalled 3 times before it touched the porch. Driver had a stroke in the cab. I should tell you here that I am not the kind of person who scares easy. At least I wasn't. I'm the kind of guy who checked under his bed ironically as a kid. The kind who debunked campfire stories for fun, but sitting in that kitchen, with the journal open between us and rain starting up again outside, I knew with total animal certainty that whatever lived in the Walker house had heard me reading about it, like a person hearing their name from the next room. That night, Mrs. Weller insisted I stay in her guest room. At 1:14 a.m., the dogs in 3 neighboring houses started barking all at once. At 1:17, they stopped. At 1:19, something knocked on Mrs. Weller's back door, 3 times. She was awake too. I could hear her in the hallway outside my room, not moving. Then a little boy's voice said, "Grandma?" Mrs. Weller made a sound I hope I never hear from another human being for as long as I live. Not a scream, more like something breaking loose inside her chest. Her grandson Ben had died in 2004, a TV accident. He was 12. The voice came again. "Grandma, I'm cold." I opened the bedroom door and found her standing in the hall with one hand over her mouth and tears running down her face. "Don't," she whispered to me. "Don't you open that door." We stood there listening. Then from the other side of the back door, Ben's voice began to cry. A perfect child's cry, wet, terrified, pleading. "Please let me in." Mrs. Weller slid to the floor. I wanted to help her. I wanted to smash every window in the house and run. Instead, I just stood there because some deeper instinct knew that whatever was outside wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to make us invited. The crying stopped. Then, after maybe 10 seconds of silence, something dragged its nails slowly down the back door from top to bottom. Not a child. Too high. Way too high. The next morning, the sheriff actually took us seriously, mostly because Mrs. Weller was a local and because the scratches on her back door went nearly to the frame overhang, about 8 feet up. Deputy Collins was in his 50s, broad-shouldered, skeptical in the practical way cops get when they've seen too much nonsense to jump at every shadow. He agreed to drive out to the Walker property with me and 2 other deputies that afternoon. I begged Mrs. Weller not to come. She didn't anyway. The 3 deputies and I approached the house around 3:30 p.m. in bright daylight. I remember that specifically because the sun was out and birds were making noise in the trees, and I kept thinking, good, this is normal. Daylight changes things. It didn't. Inside the house, the temperature dropped immediately. Deputy Collins wrinkled his nose. "What the hell is that smell?" That gave me no comfort at all. We searched room by room. First floor, clear. Then upstairs. Halfway down the hall, one of the younger deputies, Mora, called out, "Sheriff, you need to see this." In the far bedroom, the wallpaper had peeled away in a huge curling sheet, exposing plaster underneath. Names were written there. Dozens of them. Carved, scratched, gouged with something sharp enough to bite through plaster and lathe. Some were old, some looked fresh. Ruth, Samuel, Margaret, Elias, Calvin, Ben. And at the very bottom, cut deep and wet white into the wall dust, Daniel. I backed into the door frame so hard I nearly fell. Collins turned to me slowly. "You been up here alone?" "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." Then we heard the footsteps. Above us, 1 floor higher. We all looked up at the ceiling. "There is no 3rd floor," Mora said. He was right. But the steps continued, slow, heavy, crossing overhead from one end of the house to the other, back and forth, back and forth. Then something huge hit the ceiling directly over us. Dust burst down in a thick shower. One of the deputies cursed and raised his gun, and a voice from inside the wall beside me said, inches from my ear, "Found you." I don't remember deciding to run. My body just did. All 4 of us bolted for the stairs. Mora was first, then me, then Collins, then the last deputy, Hess. We made it to the front yard before realizing Hess wasn't behind us. Collins shouted his name and went back to the porch. I grabbed his arm and yelled not to, but he shook me off. He got just inside the front door when Hess screamed. It came from upstairs, then it came from the basement, then from the room right beside the front hall. Same scream, 3 places at once. Collins stumbled backward out of the house looking like every drop of blood had left his body. He kept saying, "Nope, Nope, nope. We got in the cruisers and left. Officially, Hess was listed as missing for 11 days. Then they found him walking barefoot on Route 16 at dawn, covered in dirt, eyes open so wide the whites showed all the way around. He was alive, technically. He never said a single coherent sentence again, but according to the intake notes from Wilkes Behavioral, he repeated one phrase through split lips until they sedated him. It wears us after. By then, the county finally did what it should have done decades earlier. They fenced the property, posted it, and brought in a demolition crew from out of county so nobody local had to go near it. The crew arrived on November 3rd, 2017. 3 machines, 6 men. At 9:12 a.m., the first excavator hooked the porch supports and pulled. The entire front of the house peeled away. Behind the walls, not in one room, but all through the structure, they found bones, human bones, some old enough to crumble, some not. The work stopped immediately. State investigators came in. Forensics took over. Over the next 3 weeks, they recovered remains from inside walls, crawl spaces, beneath floorboards, and packed into the root cellar earth. Official count was never publicly released. Unofficially, a man in the coroner's office told Dana's cousin there were at least 23 individuals represented. The oldest bones dated back to the mid-1800s. The newest were less than 15 years old. That alone would be enough for any story. A serial killer's den hidden inside a ghost house? Sure, people can understand that. It's awful, but it fits the world. What doesn't fit is this. None of the remains showed clear evidence of how they got there. No tool marks consistent with dismemberment, no gunshot trauma, no consistent cause of death. Several skeletons were found in spaces physically too small to place a body into without breaking every major bone first. And the root cellar, where Elias wrote that Margaret begged to be let out, contained remains from at least 9 people, but the dirt showed no signs it had ever been dug and refilled. The sheriff's office held a press conference about an ongoing criminal investigation. Then the state took jurisdiction. Then, very quietly, the story died. No arrests, no explanations. House condemned and demolished. Property restricted. That should have ended it. Everybody in Hollow Creek wanted it to end there. Just a bad place. A hidden killer. Old bones. Tragedy with a human shape. But 2 things happened after the house came down. First, the voices didn't stop. People on my road kept hearing knocks at windows, names called from the woods, dead relatives asking to be let in. Second, after demolition, surveyors discovered something under the house foundation that no property map had ever shown. A ring of older stones, not part of the Walker house, much older, set in a rough circle around the deepest part of the root cellar, as if the house had been built on top of something already there, or around it. A month later, I left Hollow Creek. I told people it was for work, and technically, that was true. I got a position in Virginia digitizing military probate records. Better pay, cleaner office. But really, I left because every night after the house was demolished, I still heard somebody walking upstairs, in houses with no second floor, hotels, apartments, my sister's ranch-style home in Greensboro, always the same pace, one end of the ceiling to the other, back and forth, back and forth. I started sleeping with white noise, then with the TV on, then not sleeping much at all. Sometimes, in that thin space right before dawn, I'd hear Laura's voice in the kitchen asking if I was awake. The problem is, Laura was alive, the real Laura. So one night, shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone, I called her. She answered on the 4th ring, sounding groggy and annoyed. "Dan, do you have any idea what time it is?" I almost cried from relief. "Yeah, sorry, I needed to hear your actual voice." There was a pause. "Are you drunk?" "No." Another pause. Then softer. "What's going on?" I almost told her everything. Instead I said, "Nothing. Bad dream." She exhaled. "You always did that." "Did what?" "Wait until you were terrified to call somebody." That was such a Laura thing to say, I actually laughed. A real laugh. For about 5 seconds I felt normal again. Then she said, Anyway, if you're hearing me in your house again, at least this time ask Ghost Me to help with rent." The laugh died in my throat. I never told her about hearing her voice, not once. I hung up without explaining and sat on the edge of my bed until sunrise. That was the moment I understood something I had been refusing to see. It wasn't copying voices from memory. It was hearing things it shouldn't have known, which meant one of two things. Either someone had told it things about me they never should have, or some part of it had come with me. I wish I could tell you I found an ending after that. A ritual, a priest, some old Appalachian woman with a jar of graveyard dirt and a perfect solution. Real life is uglier. For a while, I got better, or thought I did. Fewer voices, fewer knocks, months at a time with nothing at all. Then in 2019, Mrs. Weller died in her sleep. Heart failure, they said. Peaceful. At the funeral, Dana pulled me aside behind the fellowship hall and handed me a small manila envelope. "She left this for you," she said. Inside was a photograph, black and white, old, maybe 1950s. It showed the Walker house from the front yard. On the back, in shaky handwriting, Mrs. Weller had written, "Look at the upstairs window." I did. At first I didn't see it, then I did. There was a face in the second floor window. Not unusual for a creepy old photograph, right? Could be anyone, could be damage, could be pareidolia, except the face in the upstairs window was mine. Not kind of mine, mine. My features, my jaw, my eyes, older haircut, wrong era clothes, but my face, my knees actually weakened. I turned the photo over again, thinking maybe it was some sick joke, some modern fake, but the paper was right, the wear was right. Dana swore Mrs. Weller had kept it in her Bible for decades. I asked where she got it. Dana said, "From her mother." That photo existed at least 20 years before I was born. I don't have an explanation for that. I have theories, and every one of them is bad. Maybe the thing in Hollow Creek doesn't just imitate people. Maybe it keeps them, the way Elias Walker wrote. Maybe time doesn't mean much to something that old. Maybe once it knows your face, it can wear it backward as easily as forward. Or maybe the worst answer is true. Maybe it wasn't waiting for me. Maybe it remembered me. I've never shown that picture publicly. I nearly burned it twice. Both times I stopped because some gut-level instinct told me that if I destroyed it without understanding what I was destroying, something worse might happen. So I locked it away. That was 7 years ago. I'm writing this now because 2 nights ago, I came home from work and found muddy prints beneath my apartment kitchen window. Long handprints, too many joints. And last night, at 2:11 a.m., something knocked 3 times on the glass. I didn't look. I sat in the dark and held my breath and waited. Then I heard a man outside the window say, in my own voice, "Daniel, you've kept me out long enough." And here's the part I haven't told anyone. Not the sheriff, not Dana, not the therapist I quit after 4 sessions. This morning, when I checked the security camera by the parking lot, there was nobody outside my apartment window at 2:11. Nobody in the hall either. No one approached the building. No one left. But at 2:12 a.m., my bedroom door opened by itself, and the camera inside my apartment, because after Hollow Creek I put cameras everywhere, caught something else. It caught me stepping out into the hallway, barefoot, eyes open, smiling. I live alone, and I have no memory of that. When the footage reaches the end, I'm still standing there outside my own bedroom, facing the dark apartment like I'm listening to someone just out of frame. Then, in my own voice, but not in any way I have ever spoken in my life, I say, "You can come in now."